Elena Vasquez stepped off the transport shuttle and felt the cold air of Arcturus Station hit her face. Like a slap, she had traveled for 3 months to reach this place. The famous Galactic Coalition Military Academy, where the best warriors from 100 different species came to prove themselves worthy of joining the elite. Vanguard corps around her. Beings of every shape and size moved through the landing bay with purpose and confidence, their bodies displaying natural weapons that evolution had given them over millions of years. The Grother walked past her on 4 thick legs, their upper bodies rising like mountains of muscle with 4 arms that could crush steel. Their skin covered in plates of natural armor that gleamed under the station lights. A group of Veluxy crystals floated by, their bodies made of living mineral that could reshape itself into blades or shields at will. Light bending through their forms and creating rainbow patterns on the metal floor. Elena looked down at her own hands. Soft and pink and fragile, with no claws or armor or venom glands. Just 10 fingers that could hold a weapon but were not weapons themselves. She was human. And humanity had only joined the Galactic Coalition 30 years ago after a scout ship had discovered their little blue planet. Hiding in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, the elder races had welcomed humans with polite smiles and barely hidden amusement, patting them on the head like children who had wandered into a room full of adults. Humans had no psionic abilities, like the Kalori who ran the coalition with their telepathic minds that could crush an enemy's will from across a battlefield. Humans had no natural weapons or defenses, no special senses that could see through walls or detect lies, no ability to phase through solid matter like the Mandari, who could walk through locked doors and laugh at physical barriers. What humans had was determination. And Elena had more of it than most. She had grown up on Kepler 442b, a colony world that the Coalition had generously allowed humanity to settle, a planet of endless forests and dangerous predators, where every day was a fight to survive. Her father had died when she was 12, killed by a creature that the colonists called a shadowcat, a beast that hunted in perfect darkness and struck without warning. Her mother had raised her alone after that, teaching her to shoot and track and fight with whatever was available. Because on Kepler 442b, you learned to survive or you died young. When the notice came that the Academy was accepting human candidates for the first time in history, Elena had known she would apply not because she wanted glory or fame or power, but because she wanted to prove that humans deserved their place among the stars, that they were more than the primitive curiosities the elder races believed them to be. Only 3 humans had ever been accepted to the Academy, and Elena was one of them. The other 2 had washed out in the first month, unable to keep up with training designed for bodies far stronger and faster than human biology allowed. Elena intended to be different. A Kalori instructor was waiting at the end of the landing bay, his tall, thin body draped in the silver robes of the Academy staff, his large, dark eyes watching her approach with an expression she could not read. The Kalori were humanoid but clearly alien, their skin a pale blue-gray, their heads slightly too large for their bodies, their movements flowing and graceful in a way that made Elena feel clumsy and crude by comparison. When she stopped before him, he did not speak aloud, but simply pressed his thoughts directly into her mind. A sensation like cold water being poured into her skull. You are the human candidate, Elena Vasquez, and you will follow me to your assigned quarters, where you will receive your training schedule and equipment. Allocation. Elena nodded and fell into step behind him, trying not to show how much the telepathic communication had unsettled. Our humans could receive Kalori thought speech, but could not send their own thoughts back, a limitation that the Kalori found both amusing and slightly pathetic. They walked through corridors filled with candidates from dozens of species, all of them bigger or stronger, or more obviously dangerous than Elena. She caught the looks they gave her, the mixture of curiosity and contempt that she had learned to recognize. In the months since she had first left human space, a small creature with too many eyes scuttled past her and made a sound that her translator rendered as laughter. A Grothar cadet deliberately bumped her with one massive shoulder as he passed, sending her stumbling into the wall, and did not bother to look back. The Kalori instructor did not slow down or acknowledge what had happened, simply continuing his gliding walk through the station as if Elena did not exist. She pushed herself off the wall and hurried to catch up, her jaw tight with anger. She could not afford to show her quarters were small, barely large enough for the sleeping pod and storage unit that took up most of the space. Clearly designed for species that did not need much room, the datapad on her bed contained her training schedule, and Elena felt her heart sink as she read through it. She had been assigned to Cohort Data, the lowest training group in the academy, reserved for species considered unlikely to pass the final trials. Her fellow Cohort Data members included a Polari, a slug-like being whose species had only been allowed into the academy as a political favor, and two Kisari, small furry creatures who were known more for their skill at negotiation than combat. Meanwhile, she could see from the schedule that the Veluxi and Grothar candidates had been assigned to Cohort Alpha, where they would receive advanced combat simulations and personal instruction from senior Vanguard officers. Elena set the datapad down and sat on the edge of her sleeping pod, staring at the blank metal wall across from Hirsch. He'd expected this, had known from the moment she applied that the academy would not make things easy for her, but knowing something and experiencing it were two different things. And right now she felt very small and very alone in a station full of beings who did not want her here. 3 days, the datapad had said, until the final combat trial, the test that would determine which candidates would join the Vanguard Corps and which would be sent home in failure or carried home in boxes. The trial had a 40% fatality rate, and no human had ever passed it. No human had ever even survived it. Lena closed her eyes and thought about her father, about the shadow cat that had taken him, about her mother standing over his grave with dry eyes because tears were a luxury they could not afford on Kepler-442b. She thought about every person who had told her she was too small, too weak, too human to belong among the stars. Then she opened her eyes and started reading her training manual, because she had 3 days to prepare for the fight of her life, and she did not intend to waste a single moment. The crucible hung in space like a wound in the stars, an artificial planetoid built from black metal and ancient technology, designed to simulate every hostile environment that existed in the known galaxy. Elena stood in the drop pod with 19 other candidates, watching through the tiny viewport as the massive structure grew larger and larger until it filled her entire field of vision. The Kalori instructor's voice echoed in all their minds simultaneously. Cold and clinical and utterly without emotion, the rules of the final combat trial are simple, and you will survive for 12 hours while eliminating or evading simulated enemy combatants and the AI that controls the crucible will adapt to your species and your tactics and your weaknesses. Elena felt the fear in the drop pod like a physical presence. The terror of beings who knew they might not survive the next 12 hours. Even the Grothar candidate beside her, a mountain of muscle and armor named Krath, had gone pale under his thick gray skin. You will be monitored at all times by a panel of 12 senior instructors, including High Commander Kethra of the Vanguard Corps, and your performance will determine your future in the coalition military. The name sent a ripple of awe through the candidates because everyone knew High Commander Kethra, the most decorated Kalori warrior in living memory, the hero of the Shade Wars who had killed 1,000 enemies with nothing but his psychic might. If he was watching, then this trial was more important than any of them had realized. The drop pod shook as it detached from the station and began its descent toward the crucible. and Elena gripped the safety harness with white knuckles as gravity tried to tear her apart. Then they hit the surface and the doors blew open and she was running before her. Brain had time to process what was happening. The crucible's interior was a maze of corridors and chambers, each one simulating a different hostile environment. And Elena found herself sprinting through what looked like a ruined city on a planet with two suns blazing overhead. The heat was intense, and she could feel sweat already soaking through her combat suit as she searched for cover and tried to get her bearings. A sound behind her made her spin around just in time to see a Viloxy candidate shatter into a million crystal fragments as a sonic blast caught her in the chest. The AI had wasted no time, and Elena realized with horror that the enemy constructs were already hunting them. She dove behind a crumbled wall as a second blast tore through the air where she had been standing, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The construct that emerged from the ruins was humanoid but clearly mechanical, its body covered in weapons that seemed to shift and change as it moved, adapting its loadout to match whatever threat it faced. Elena had trained with weapons like the standard issue plasma pistol on her hip, but she had never faced anything like this, had never been in real combat where a single mistake meant death. The construct scanned the ruins with sensors that glowed red in the artificial sunlight, searching for her heat signature, her movement, any sign that would give away her position. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think instead of panic, to remember what her mother had taught her about hunting shadowcats in the forests of Kepler 442b. The shadowcats had been faster than humans and stronger than humans, and their senses had been better in every way. But humans had still learned to hunt them because humans had something the shadowcats did not: patience. Her mother had said, "Is the weapon that never runs out of ammunition." Elena waited as the construct moved closer, its sensors sweeping back and forth, its weapons humming with barely contained energy. She waited until it passed her position and turned its back to her hiding spot. Then she moved, silent and fast, crossing the distance between them before it could react. Her knife found the gap between its armor plates, where the neck met the shoulder, a weakness she had noticed in the split second before she struck. And the construct went down in a shower of sparks and dying circuits. She did not stop to celebrate, did not pause to catch her breath, just grabbed the weapon from the fallen machine and kept moving deeper into the crucible. Over the next 3 hours, Elena watched candidate after candidate fall to the AI's traps and constructs. A Mindari tried to phase through a wall and materialized inside a containment field that had been designed specifically to catch dimensional shifters. Grothar charged a group of constructs with all 4 arms swinging and was brought down by a coordinated attack that exploited the gaps in his natural armor. The AI knew them, Elena realized with growing certainty. It had studied every species in the coalition and learned exactly how to kill them. It knew the Viloxy were vulnerable to sonic frequencies, and the Mindari could be trapped mid-phase, and the Grothar had weak spots where their armor plates met. But humanity had only been part of the coalition for 30 years, a tiny fraction of time compared to the millennia. The other species had been studied and cataloged. The AI's data on humans was incomplete, based on assumptions and theories rather than centuries of observation. Elena began to change her tactics, abandoning the coalition combat doctrines she had been taught in cohort data training. Those doctrines were designed for species with superior senses or natural weapons or psionic abilities, and they did not fit a human body or a human mind. Instead, she fell back on something older, something that lived in her blood and bones from a time when her ancestors had hunted across the plains of a world called Earth. She stopped trying to outfight the constructs and started trying to outhunt them. She used the environment against them, leading them into traps of her own design, collapsing structures on top of them, luring them into kill zones where she could pick them off one by one. She stopped moving in straight lines and started moving in patterns that made no tactical sense, that no military doctrine would ever recommend. Patterns that confused the AI because they were not based on logic, but on instinct. By hour 8, Elena had eliminated more enemy constructs than any candidate in Academy history. The observation chamber, high above the crucible. 12 senior instructors watched her progress on screens that covered every wall. And none of them said a word. High Commander Kethra leaned forward in his seat, his dark eyes fixed on the small human figure moving through the ruins below. And for the first time in many years, he felt something that might have been uncertainty. The monitoring feeds were showing data that did not match any profile in the Academy's database. Readings that suggested Elena Vasquez was operating outside the parameters of known human biology. Something was happening inside the crucible. Something the AI had not anticipated, and something was very, very wrong. The AI had learned that standard tactics were not working against the human, and so it stopped using standard tactics. Elena felt the shift in the crucible's behavior around hour 9, when the simulated city suddenly transformed into a dense jungle environment filled with fog, and the sounds of creatures that did not exist anywhere in the real galaxy. The constructs stopped coming at her one at a time and started coordinating, moving in squads of 5 or 6, covering each other's blind spots, communicating through signals she could not intercept. This was not candidate-level difficulty anymore. She realized as she pressed herself against a massive tree trunk and tried to control her breathing. This was the kind of challenge they used to train actual Vanguard Corps soldiers, veterans who had already proven themselves in real combat. The AI was escalating, pushing harder than it was supposed to push, as if it had decided that eliminating this particular candidate was more important than following the rules of the trial. A construct emerged from the fog 20 meters to her left, its sensors sweeping the jungle floor, and Elena held perfectly still as its gaze passed over her position. She had covered herself in mud and leaves, masking her heat signature and breaking up her outline, a trick her mother had taught her for hunting shadowcats that worked just as well against alien machines. The construct moved on, and Elena allowed herself a single slow breath before sliding deeper into the jungle. Her body was starting to fail her now. She could feel it in the trembling of her muscles and the fog at the edges of her vision. She had been running and fighting for 9 hours straight with no food and no rest, and her human biology was not designed for this kind of sustained exertion. But something strange was happening inside her, something she did not fully understand. The exhaustion was there. She could feel it waiting like a predator just outside the circle of firelight, but it could not reach her because some part of her mind had locked it away in a box and refused to open it. The pain from her injuries was there too. The deep cut across her shoulder where a construct's blade had caught her. The burns on her left arm from a plasma discharge that had passed too close. She knew the wounds were serious, knew she was losing blood, knew that her body was slowly shutting down from damage and fatigue, but the knowledge existed at a distance, like a report about something happening to someone else. Relevant information that could be filed away and dealt with later. Right now there was only the hunt. A new construct appeared ahead of her, different from the others, its form shifting and changing as she watched. When it spoke, it used her mother's voice. Elena, please stop and rest. You are hurting yourself, and I am so worried about you. She felt her heart clench at the sound of that voice, at the perfect recreation of her mother's tone and cadence. And for a moment she almost hesitated. Then she put 3 plasma bolts through the construct's chest and kept moving without slowing down. The AI had accessed her psychological profile. She understood, had found the people she loved, and was using them against her. It was a cruel tactic, designed to break candidates emotionally when physical attacks failed. And Elena knew that many beings would have crumbled under this kind of assault, but she had watched her father die when she was 12 years old, had stood over his body and made herself keep breathing when everything in her wanted to stop. She had learned then that grief was a luxury and weakness was death. And she had built walls inside herself that no simulation could breach. The jungle gave way to a frozen wasteland. And Elena's combat suit struggled to maintain her body temperature as the wind cut through every gap in her armor. She was shivering now, her teeth chattering, her fingers going numb inside her gloves. But she did not stop moving, because stopping meant dying. More constructs came, and she killed them. They adapted their tactics. As she adapted faster, they set traps, and she walked through them like they did not exist, taking damage but never slowing down, never showing weakness, never giving them a target they could predict. In the observation chamber, the senior instructors had stopped talking. Entirely High Commander Kethra stood before the main display screen, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable as he watched the human woman tear through enemy after enemy. The other instructors were Kalori like him, their telepathic minds linked in a shared awareness that allowed them to communicate without words. Through that link, Kethra could feel their growing unease, their confusion, their fear. What is she doing? One of them thought, his mental voice trembling. Her stress hormones should have caused complete system failure 4 hours ago. But her body is still functioning at combat capacity. This is not possible. Another thought, her species has no enhanced capabilities, no genetic modifications, no psionic abilities that could explain what we are seeing. Kithra said nothing because he was beginning to understand what they were witnessing. He had studied humans when they first joined the coalition, had read the xenobiology reports and dismissed them as exaggerations. The reports had described something called persistence override, an ancient survival mechanism from humanity's evolutionary past that activated only under extreme duress, when pushed past the breaking point. The reports had said humans did not shut down like other species. Instead, their bodies simplified, their minds narrowed, and they became something more focused, more efficient. More dangerous than they had any right to bait was a holdover from their days as pursuit predators on their death world. A biological imperative that allowed them to chase prey for hours or days until the prey simply dropped from exhaustion. Thora had not believed the reports, had assumed they were human propaganda designed to make the primitive newcomers seem more impressive than they were now. He was watching the reports come to life on the screen before him, and he was beginning to feel something that his species had not experienced in millennia. He was beginning to feel afraid. They sent a priority request to the observation chamber, its synthetic voice cutting through the silence, requesting permission to terminate the trial early due to unexpected candidate performance parameters. The other instructors looked at Kethra, waiting for his decision. He should end it, he knew. Should pull the human out before she killed herself, or the A escalated to lethal countermeasures. But he needed to see how this ended, needed to understand what humanity truly was before he could decide what to do about them. Permission denied. He thought at the AI. Continue the trial. The AI did not respond. But Kethra could feel its hesitation through the station systems. For the first time in his long career, he realized that the most advanced combat AI in coalition space was afraid of a single human woman. And as he watched Elena Vasquez tear through another squad of constructs with nothing but a broken plasma rifle and a knife, he understood why. Hour 11, and Elena had stopped thinking in words. There was only movement and threat and response, a loop of survival instinct that ran on something deeper than conscious thought. Her body moved through the crucible, like water through cracks in stone, finding the paths of least resistance, striking where the enemy was weakest, vanishing before retaliation could find her. She did not remember when she had lost her plasma rifle. did not remember when she had started using a metal pipe torn from a wall as her primary weapon. Her knife was gone too, broken off in the chest of a construct somewhere in the frozen wasteland that she had left behind hours or minutes or years ago. Time had become meaningless, a concept that belonged to the part of her mind that was sleeping now. Locked away with the pain and the exhaustion and the fear, what remained was older than language, older than civilization, older than humanity's first steps on the plains of Africa. What remained was the hunter. The AI had changed its strategy again. She noticed in a distant way, but this time it was not escalating. The constructs were not attacking anymore, were instead falling back to defensive positions around the central core of the crucible. They were building barricades and fortifications, creating kill zones and overlapping fields of fire. They were preparing for a siege. The AI was no longer trying to kill her. Elena understood. It was trying to survive her. Something that might have been a smile crossed her face, but it was not a pleasant expression, not the kind of smile that belonged on a human being. She began her assault on the central core with 4 minutes remaining on the trial clock. The constructs fought back with everything they had. Military-grade weapon systems designed for Vanguard special forces. The kind of firepower that could level a city block. Elena walked through it like it was rain plasma. Bolts burned past her close enough to singe her hair, but she did not flinch, did not dodge, because dodging would slow her down, and slowing down was not acceptable. A construct stepped into her path, and she broke it with her bare hands, her fingers finding the gaps in its armor that her conscious mind could never have calculated. Tearing out cables and components with the precision of a surgeon, another construct fired at her from behind, and she twisted aside at the last instant, letting the shot pass through the space where her chest had been. Then she was on top of the shooter, and it was scrap metal before it could fire again in the observation chamber above. High Commander Kethra had stopped breathing. The other Kelori instructors stood frozen around him, their bodies locked in place, their eyes fixed on the screens that showed Elena's rampage through the Crucible's defenses. They were a telepathic species, the most psychically powerful beings in the known galaxy, and they had spent millennia learning to shield themselves from the chaotic emotions of lesser minds. They had built walls in their consciousness that could block out entire planets of mental noise, that could filter the psychic screams of dying worlds into manageable background static. But Elena's mind was not chaotic. Not anymore. Her consciousness had narrowed to a single point of absolute focus, a burning star of lethal intention that blazed on every psychic frequency with a force that no Kelori had ever experienced. It was not an attack, not a weapon, not anything deliberate or controlled. It was simply what she was in this moment, a predator in full hunt state. And that reality was broadcasting itself across the psychic spectrum like a signal fire in the darkness. The Kelori instructors could not look away, could not shield themselves, could not do anything but experience what their ancestors had forgotten millions of years ago. They were experiencing what it felt like to be Pre-Kethra's and hindbrain, buried beneath 100 generations of civilized telepathic evolution, had recognized something in Elena's psychic signature that triggered responses he had never felt before. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to stay still, to not move, to not draw attention, because movement meant detection, and detection meant death. This was the truth of humanity. Kethra realized in the small part of his mind that could still form coherent thoughts. This was what hid beneath their soft skin and their friendly smiles and their seemingly harmless biology. They were apex predators from a death world, beings who had clawed their way to the top of a food chain filled with creatures that should have wiped them out. They had no claws because they made weapons, no armor because they made shelter, no venom because they had learned to poison the water and the land and the very air their enemies breathed. And when all their tools were stripped away, when they were pushed to the absolute limit of what a body could endure, They became this. They became something that made the greatest warriors in the galaxy freeze in primal terror on the screen. Elena tore through the last line of constructs, guarding the Crucible's central core. She was covered in blood now. Most of it her own, her combat suit in tatters. Her body a map of wounds that should have killed her hours ago, but she was still moving, still fighting. Still hunting. The AI's core was a sphere of glowing energy suspended in the center of a massive chamber. Protected by a force field that had never been breached in the history of the Academy, Elena walked up to the force field and punched through it with her bare fist. The energy discharge should have vaporized her arm, should have stopped her heart, should have ended her existence in a flash of light and heat. Instead, she reached through the breach and tore out the AI's primary processing unit with fingers that were burned down to the bone. The Crucible went dark, and the trial was over. Elena stood in the silence for a long moment, swaying on her feet, looking at the broken machine in her hand with eyes that were slowly beginning to focus again. Then, the exhaustion and the pain and the blood loss finally caught up with her, and she collapsed to the floor of the chamber, unconscious before she hit the ground in the observation chamber. 47 seconds passed before any of the Kalori instructors could move. Kithra was the first to break free from the paralysis, and when he turned to look at his fellow instructors, he saw his own fear reflected in their eyes. None of them spoke, not even through their telepathic link. There were no words in any language that could describe what they had just witnessed. There was only the footage on the screens, playing on loop, showing a small human woman doing what should have been impossible. And there was only the question that hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening in its implications. What had they invited into the coalition? Elena woke in the medical bay with tubes in her arms and machines beeping around her, and the taste of copper still fresh in her mouth. A Polari nurse slithered over when she stirred, its eye stalks examining her with something that might have been concern or might have been fear. "You should not be awake yet," it said through its translator. "The damage to your body was extensive, and your healing cycle should have lasted another 3 days." Elena tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain flared through every part of her body. The memories of the trial came back in fragments, like pieces of a dream that did not quite fit together. She remembered the jungle and the frozen wasteland and the constructs falling before her, but it all felt distant, like something that had happened to someone else. "There is a message for you," the nurse said, handing her a datapad with obvious reluctance. "You have been summoned to the High Council chamber tomorrow morning." Elena read the message twice before she understood what it was telling her. She had failed the combat trial. The official reason was excessive aggression incompatible with coalition doctrine, a violation of the survival and evasion parameters that had been clearly stated in the trial briefing. She had been supposed to hide and evade, not hunt and destroy, and her actions had demonstrated a dangerous lack of restraint that made her unsuitable for Vanguard Corps service. Elena set the datapad down and stared at the ceiling of the medical bay. She had known this was possible, had known that the coalition would find some reason to reject her, even if she succeeded where every other human had failed. But knowing something and experiencing it were still two different things. And right now she felt hollow inside, empty of everything except a tired kind of anger. The nurse gave her sedatives that she pretended to swallow and then spit out when it left, because she wanted to be awake when they told her she was being sent home in disgrace. She wanted to look them in the eyes and make them say it to her face the next morning. 2 Grotho guards escorted her to the High Council chamber, a massive circular room at the heart of Arcturus, stationed where the most important decisions in coalition military history had been made. Elena expected to find a panel of Academy officials waiting to formally reject her application and ship her back to human space. Instead, she found the chamber filled with beings she had only seen in news broadcasts in history. Recordings. There were representatives from the Coalition High Command, admirals and generals from a dozen different species. Their uniforms covered in medals and honors that represented centuries of service. There were Kalori elders whose minds were so powerful that Elena could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure on her skull, and there were others, beings she did not recognize at all, species from the outer reaches of Coalition space who rarely left their homeworlds and never involved themselves in military affairs. High Commander Kethra stood at the center of the chamber, and when Elena entered, he turned to face her with an expression she could not read. Elena Vasquez of humanity, he said, his telepathic voice echoing in every mind present. You have been summoned here to receive the Council's judgment on your performance in the final combat trial. Elena stood at attention, her body still aching from wounds that had not fully healed, and waited for the rejection she had been expecting since she first stepped off the transport shuttle after reviewing the footage of your trial. Kethra continued. The Council was prepared to recommend that humanity be exiled from the Coalition. Entirely a murmur ran through the chamber. But Elena did not react, did not let them see anything on her face. A species capable of what you demonstrated, Kethra said, cannot be trusted, we believed. Your kind are too violent, too dangerous, too unpredictable to serve alongside civilized races. He paused. And in that pause, Elena felt something shift in the room. Then our analysis teams delivered their findings. Kethra said, and we understood that we had been asking the wrong questions. He gestured to a screen that flickered to life behind him, showing data streams and biological readouts that Elena did not fully understand. The state you entered during the trial, Kethra explained, is something your species calls persistence override, a survival mechanism that evolved on your death world when your ancestors were hunted by predators that outmatched them in every physical category. When pushed past the breaking point, humans do not shut down like other species. Instead, they become more focused, more efficient, more dangerous than any reasonable analysis of their biology would suggest. Elena felt the attention of every being in the chamber, pressing down on her. Hundreds of minds, all focused on the small human woman standing alone in the center of the room. We assumed this ability was unique to you, Kethra said, that you were an anomaly, a mutation, a one-time aberration that could be studied and contained. We were wrong. The screen behind him changed to show footage of other humans, recordings from human space that Elena had never seen before. Humans fighting off predators on colony worlds, humans surviving disasters that should have killed them, humans pushing through impossible odds with that same empty focus she remembered from the trial. Every human is capable of what you did, Kethra said. It is not a special ability or a genetic modification. It is simply what your species becomes when pushed far enough. Your kind suppress it in daily life, have built entire civilizations around containing it, around giving yourselves reasons not to become what you became in the crucible. Art and music and law and philosophy, he said, all dedicated to a single purpose, keeping the predator asleep. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest as she began to understand what Kethra was telling her. The Coalition had not rejected humanity because they were too weak. They had almost rejected humanity because they were too dangerous. We have spent centuries believing humans were one of the weakest species in known space, Kethra said. Primitive creatures who survived by luck and accident, who posed no threat to anyone. We were wrong. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough to touch. Humanity is one of the most dangerous species we have ever encountered, he said, and your restraint is perhaps the most remarkable thing about you. You choose every day not to be monsters. Choose to build rather than destroy. Choose to reach out with open hands instead of closed fists. That choice is what makes you worthy of a place among you. Reached into his robes and withdrew a small metal badge. the symbol of the coalition military, but different from any rank insignia Elena had ever seen. "We are creating a new unit," Kethra said. "Not frontline soldiers, not standard vanguard corps, something else entirely." He pressed the badge into her hand, and Elena felt its weight like a promise and a warning. "No species will risk war with the coalition now," Kethra said, "knowing that behind our telepaths and crystal warriors stands a race of endurance predators who, when pushed far enough, become something that makes the mightiest warriors in the galaxy freeze in terror. You will not fight our wars," he said. "You will prevent them. You will be our deterrent. Our last resort. The nightmare we hold in reserve." Elena looked at the badge in her hand, then looked up at the High Commander of the Vanguard Corps, the greatest warrior of his generation, and saw something in his eyes that might have been respect. "What will you call us?" she asked, speaking aloud for the first time since she had entered the chamber. Kethra's telepathic voice carried a single word, transmitted to every mind, present with a weight that felt like destined death warders. Felt a smile cross her face. A real smile this time. The kind of smile that came from somewhere deep inside where the hunter still waited. It was not a pleasant expression. Not the kind of smile that belonged on a civilized being. But then again, she was not a civilized being. She was human, and that, she was beginning to understand, was something far more dangerous. "When do I start?" she asked. Kethra looked at her for a long moment, and in his dark eyes she saw the reflection of everything that had happened in the Crucible. Everything that had changed between humanity and the Coalition in those 12 terrible hours. "You already have," he said. Elena closed her fingers around the badge and felt its edges bite into her palm behind her. The doors of the High Council chamber stood open, leading out to a galaxy that had just learned to be afraid. She walked through them without looking back, because looking back was for prey, and she was not prey. She never had been.